Good morning. We'll call the meeting to order. Once again, we still have a hybrid hearing, so some members are participating virtually, and there are rules for that, which I'll read to get us started here. Members who are joining remotely must be visible on screen for the purposes of identity verification, establishing and maintaining a quorum, participating in the proceeding, and voting. Those members must continue to use the software platform's video function while in attendance unless they experience connectivity issues or other technical problems that render them unable to participate on camera. If a member experiences technical difficulties, they should contact the committee staff for assistance. Video of members' participation will be broadcast in the room and via the television and internet feeds. Members participating remotely must seek recognition verbally, and they are asked to mute their microphones when they are not speaking. Members who are not participating remotely who are participating remotely are reminded to keep the software platform's video function on the entire time they attend the proceeding. Members may leave and rejoin the proceeding. If members depart for a short while for reasons other than joining a different proceeding, they should leave the video function on. If members will be absent for a significant period or depart to join a different proceeding, they should exit the software platform entirely and then rejoin it if they return. Members may use the software platform's chat feature to communicate with staff regarding technical or logistical support issues only. Finally, I have designated a committee staff member to, if necessary, mute unrecognized members' microphones to cancel any inadvertent background noise that may disrupt that proceeding. Thank you. So this morning we are having a hearing basically to discuss the budget. You know, part of that is certainly the top line, the overall number, but I'm also really hopeful that our witnesses will get into the issues of where we spend that money, how things are changing and evolving, and how we spend the money, what capabilities. Obsessively focusing on numbers misses the point that it really matters where we spend it. We have three witnesses this morning. We have Dr. Stacy Pettyjohn, who is the Senior Fellow and Director for the Defense Program for the Center for a New American Security, represented on the rather awesome-looking screen, if I may say. Kudos to my staff. That's it's almost like she's actually here. It looks awesome. So, welcome. We have Miss Mandy Smithberger, who is the Director of the Center for Defense Information Project on Government Oversight, and Mr. Roger Zakheim, well known to the committee as former HASC staffer. Good to have you back, and is now the Director of Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Well, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the purpose of this hearing is to talk about the budget, the numbers, how much money we should be spending on defense and where we should be spending it. This is something that's going to play out a great deal in the next 4 or 5 months. There are obviously differences of opinion in appropriators, House, Senate, Republican, Democrat, on exactly what that number should be. I have said publicly and will continue to say I support President Biden's budget. I think the number is right. I think there is absolutely no reason on earth why we cannot adequately defend the country for $753 billion. It is actually a larger increase than the increase we got from President Trump's budget last year. And I think we worked those numbers out perfectly fine. But part of the discussion is, if you think the number should be higher, tell us why. If you think the number should be lower, tell us why. But the other part of it that is really important is, where do those numbers come from? And those numbers come from the National Defense Strategy. That's where it all starts. And from the National Defense Strategy, we build down a series of requirements, things that we think we have to be able to do. And most of the numbers that I've seen during my 25 years on this committee don't think too much further than that. Okay, well, it's in the National Defense Strategy. It is a requirement. Therefore, we have to spend the money. But the job that I want to see this committee do is to look at that. Well, why is that a requirement? Does that requirement make sense? Does that actually meet our needs? Was that a requirement that we came up with 25 years ago and just decided never to change our mind, so we keep moving forward? We need to really think seriously about those requirements all the time, but now in particular, because of the changing nature of our defense strategy and of the threats we face. We have all, very much familiar with the fact that Russia and China now are rising peer competitors at a minimum, and certainly the distinct possibility of them being threats. For the last 20 years, much of our focus has been on asymmetric warfare, transnational terrorist groups and their threat. That's a different set of priorities than having to figure out how to deter adversaries with the size and capability of Russia, China, and even emerging countries like Iran and North Korea. That requires us to rethink a number of those requirements. But also, the nature of warfare has changed in that how important information has become. In order to be successful, we have to, number one, be able to access a large amount of information. That part we've gotten fairly good at. But number two, we got to figure out within that incredible morass, what do we really need to know? How do we find the information in that pile? People often refer to it as trying to find a needle in a haystack. I always like the way a counter-terrorism guy said, no, it's like trying to find a needle in a needle stack. They're all important, but which one is the one we're looking for today and in this moment, and how do we find it? And then how do you get that information out to the people who need it in real time? It's great as some analyst, back at the Pentagon can see it, but what about the pilot, the ship captain, the infantryman out there on the front lines? Does he or she have that information in that moment, and how do we do that? And then, as we've all learned, how do you protect all of that so that an adversary cannot disrupt it or cut it off? We are not as good at that as we need to be. And also, there is the survivability question. Large platforms are simply not as survivable as they used to be. And I'm really struck by the swarm of drones issue. A weapon of war that is being used increasingly in the Middle East was used in the Armenian conflict, where for a relatively small amount of money, I think it's south of $1 million, you put together a swarm of drones that could pack an incredible punch. And the truly interesting thing about it is you can't see them coming. And I know I have been picking on the F-35 of late. The program is incredibly important, but it also deserves to be picked upon given the amount of money it's gone over budget and the difficulties we've had with it. But think about this, $75 million airplane, F-35, can't get into some areas that a swarm of drones that cost several $100,000 can. How does that change what systems we need, what requirements we have in order to get in and attack these places? So I really want to get into that examination of requirements, and I'll close with something that I've complained about a great deal. I mentioned that requirements get built, and once a requirement gets built, we accept that as therefore we must spend the money. I also see this in the combatant commander issue. Whenever a member is trying to advocate for spending more money on a given program, inevitably they will point to the fact that only 60% of the combatant commander's requests for this particular platform were met last year. Well, if you really look at that, we never meet the combatant commander's request. We never even come close, all right? Now, does that mean that we are desperately at jeopardy and are way underspending? Or might it also mean that we don't have the right requirements set? That we don't have the right mission statement for what we truly need to accomplish. And I think that's the question that I'm really interested in. At the end of that, it may well come out that we need a little bit more money, or it may come out that we need a little bit less. But we really have to understand what we're spending it on and how much we're getting for those dollars spent. Not just focus on, well, we need more. Isn't more always better? No, actually, in many instances it is not. We got to make sure we have the right capabilities. So I look forward to the testimony and the questions and answers. And with that, I yield to Mr. Rogers for his opening statement.
Thank you. And I would point out from the beginning, my friend, the chairman, likes to emphasize that this year's increase is larger than the president's last budget increase. However, it's basically a $4 billion cut in real dollars, and the last president over 4 years increased defense spending 13% over the rate of inflation. So if this president's budget proposal were carried over 4 years, it'd be half of what Trump did over his 4 years. But I want to thank our witnesses for being here. Today, the committee is hearing the views of non-governmental stakeholders on the president's defense budget. Over the past month, we've heard budget presentations from Secretary Austin, Chairman Milley, and each of the service chiefs and secretaries. To date, no one has been able to successfully put lipstick on this pig. The fact remains this budget is woefully inadequate. It doesn't keep pace with China. It doesn't even keep pace with inflation. In fact, it constitutes a cut of over $4 billion in real dollars. The budget cuts the number of Navy ships and destabilizes the shipbuilding industry. It slashes procurement across the board. It guts missile defense. It leaves unfunded over $25 billion in combatant commanders' priorities. It accelerates the divestment of critical capabilities for replacements before replacements are available, and it cuts the size of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps. We've heard a lot about this budget, how this budget invests in modernization while maintaining readiness, but it actually does neither. Accelerating divestments and slashing the budget for new ships, aircraft, and combatant vehicles saves $13 billion, but it undermines readiness by creating dangerous gaps in near-term capability. To make matters worse, the $13 billion savings are not being reinvested in the development of next-generation capability. In fact, those savings are not being reinvested anywhere in the DoD. Instead, they're being used to pay for a colossal list of far-left priorities. The President's proposing to swell non-defense spending by a massive 16%, and that doesn't count the nearly $2 trillion already wasted on a so-called COVID stimulus bill earlier this year that less than 10% dealt with COVID. Over all the $4 trillion in new mandatory spending the President and Democrats are intending to ram through Congress later this summer. None of that money, not a single dollar, will be spent on the defense of this nation. We're going to talk a lot about the National Defense Strategy today and how to properly resource it, but by the looks of this budget, it appears that President Biden has already settled on a new strategy, and it's a stark departure from the past. Instead of deterring conflict with China through strength, we're inviting conflict through weakness. And if the President continues to underfund national security, we will lose that conflict. That's unacceptable. But it doesn't have to be that way. I urge my colleagues to reject this budget and work in a bipartisan manner to make necessary investments for our national defense. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Pettyjohn, you are recognized. We'll see if it's working in a second, but I'm confident it will be. Go ahead.
Thank you. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rogers, distinguished members of the committee and the staff, thank you for inviting me to testify today in the fiscal year 2022 defense budget. My remarks draw on a new Center for a New American Security report that I co-authored with Becca Wasser and Jenny Matuszek. According to Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, the $715 billion FY22 defense budget is focused on deterring China, the department's pacing challenge, and is biased towards the future. There are, however, signs in the FY22 budget that the next national defense strategy might not sufficiently prioritize deterring great power aggression, which requires developing a military capable of defeating a conventional attack and strengthening strategic stability. This is disconcerting because absent significant changes to the current U.S. force structure, considerable investments in emerging technologies, and the development of new operating concepts, the U.S. military could lose a war against a great power like China or Russia. For too long, the Pentagon has ignored the problem, and as a result, the U.S. military edge is eroding. An example is the FY22 budget, which simultaneously funds advanced capabilities to counter China and Russia, sustains a high level of readiness, and maintains service and strength. This suggests that the administration is trying to do too much with too little. There are serious risks with this approach. Addressing today's needs will likely continue to prevent investments in the future. And as the military tries to do more with less, it might find itself trying to do everything, but doing few things well. This is because it is unclear how the next national defense strategy will handle two critical issues. The first is the prioritization of threats. Will the department explicitly preference China and secondarily Russia over other challenges, or will it balance among an expanded list that includes persistent threats, climate change, and biothreats? Second, what is the primary role for the Department of Defense and the level of urgency associated with the China challenge? Should the U.S. military compete below the threshold of armed conflict today, or should the Pentagon focus on building a future force capable of defeating a great power adversary in a large-scale war tomorrow? It is unlikely that the United States can build a force for competition and warfighting within any credible top-line budget. In our CNAS report, we developed 3 strategies and associated force structures and tested them in a series of tabletop exercises on daily competition, subconventional territorial aggression, and large-scale conventional attacks. We found that the strategy we call full spectrum competition most closely resembles the Biden administration's current approach of balancing near-term competition with modernization and high-end deterrence. Notably, this strategy performed poorly against priority threats. It cannot defeat a large-scale conventional invasion of Taiwan or the Baltics, nor can it halt subconventional aggression. It also risks significant overstretch and technological overmatch. Similarly, a competition-focused strategy that builds a large visible force to actively contest daily military provocations and expects to deter through presence also fails to defeat both subconventional land grabs and conventional aggression. More optimistically, our analysis suggests that it is possible to build a force capable of winning one big conflict and overturning subconventional aggression within the current top-line budget, but only by accepting some near-term risk in subconventional competition against other threats and in other regions. It's important to remember that the FY22 budget is largely a legacy one. Although this budget makes some significant investments that align with a high-end deterrence strategy, it does not go far enough. As the Pentagon is still developing the next NDS, there is still an opportunity to course correct. For more than a decade, analysts have been warning the Department of Defense that the US military could lose a war against a great power adversary if it does not significantly change the size and composition of its force and the way that it fights. Too much time has been lost. The Pentagon must prioritize the future now. Divestments are necessary to fund modernization, but alone they are not sufficient. The dual conventional and nuclear modernization bill that is now due requires larger traits among capacity, capability, and readiness. Because military personnel costs are growing more than the overall budget, they reduce the resources available for modernization, shrinking the size of the active duty force, particularly the Army, which plays an important but supporting role in the Indo-Pacific theater, frees up resources to focus on high-end deterrence against China. The 2022 National Defense Strategy and the FY23 budget will need to accept more risk and further prioritize to prepare the force for the most challenging and consequential threats. If the Biden administration does not make these hard choices, or Congress chooses not to support this strategy, it risks losing the United States military technological edge and the ability to win a war against a great power. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Smithberger, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rogers, and members of the committee for inviting me to testify before you today. My name is Mandy Smithberger, and I'm the Director of the Center for Defense Information at the Project on Government Oversight. I want to thank the committee for holding this hearing today. We think that Pentagon spending is continuing to rise at an unsustainable rate, now more than at the peak of the Reagan buildup, but too often we are paying too much money for too little capability. Throwing even more money at the department will only make the problems worse and undermine the kinds of reforms we need to see at the department. We have to have accountability for failed programs and wasted funds, including real budget consequences. The Biden administration's budget proposes cutting a number of legacy programs to fund modernization. The department must make trade-offs and set priorities, but we worry that in too many instances, the department proposes getting rid of proven and usually cheaper systems in favor of immature technology that cost significantly more. The cost of failed or delayed modernization programs can be substantial. Over the course of a decade, the department had to cancel programs we'd already sunk $46 billion into. Many of those canceled programs promised leaps in technology that ultimately could not be affordably achieved. It's also vital that we understand the human cost of failed modernization programs. Delays can contribute to preventable accidents and loss of life. The National Commission on Military Aviation Safety found that maintenance and safety of legacy systems across the services deteriorated as leaders took resources from them for new programs. When there were delays in those new programs, the lives of the now under-serviced legacy systems had to be extended for years. While many have blamed readiness shortfalls on insufficient funding, the Commission made clear this was not the case, saying their primary fiscal concern is not the amount of money, but that they couldn't count on it. We have a responsibility to change course and save lives. I want to give you an example of a program in this budget that shows that new systems that are too expensive to maintain or upgrade can quickly become irrelevant legacies. This budget proposes retiring 4 littoral combat ships. We support this cut, but it's emblematic of wasteful spending that could and should have been avoided at the outset. It's not difficult to imagine a similar fate for the F-35. Low readiness rates and high maintenance costs have turned what should be a workhorse into something the Air Force Chief of Staff called a Ferrari, to be used sparingly. This is a case study of the massive waste caused by buying before we fly. If there's only one thing you take away from what I say today, we must make sure that we fly before we buy. We understand the need to speed up the acquisition process, but rushing unproven technology into production increases costs and undermines readiness. Programs should start with a process that meaningfully analyzes alternatives for new systems, leverages competition and prototyping, and enables oversight and transparency throughout the process. There are a number of areas ripe for cuts without compromising military effectiveness, and I'm going to tell you about three: the shadow workforce, the department's wish list, and nuclear spending. First, the shadow workforce. Last year, the department spent nearly $204 billion on service contracts. POGO's review of government data found that contractor employees cost nearly 3 times more than the average civilian employee. The Defense Business Board and the Pentagon have found similar trends. We urge more transparency and enhanced reporting to improve oversight and inform smart cuts. Second, the department's wish lists. Giving services and components 2 bites at the apple increases the already palpable pressure to increase spending. Congress should eliminate the statutory requirement in all wish lists, whether they are submitted by statute or by request, should include recommended offsets within the component's own budget. Finally, nuclear weapons spending. In a single year, projected spending on nuclear weapons activities increased by 29%, or $113 billion. The upcoming nuclear posture review is an important opportunity to consider ways to reduce these costs. This year's budget also includes reforms we hope the committee will support, most notably eliminating the Overseas Contingency Operations account. We urge the committee not to resurrect this account or create new ones. The Department of Defense budget aims to address a number of major emerging national security challenges. Responding to many of these future challenges cannot be solely or even principally led by the department. Ensuring our security for the future will require balancing resources to enable the United States to make the best use of the power of our economy, the power of our diplomacy, and our capacity for innovation. For example, addressing China, climate change, and cybersecurity will all require whole-of-government approaches. We must rein in Pentagon spending and ensure that every dollar improves our national security and supports all of those who protect us. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Mr. Zakheim.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rogers, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. It's truly an honor to be back before this committee. My testimony, which I will summarize here, considers the strategic and budgetary requirements necessary to compete with the Chinese Communist Party, as well as other significant threats, notably Russia, Iran, North Korea, as well as terrorism, cyber, and digital threats. My approach reflects a peace through strength strategy that aligns with the findings and recommendations of the bipartisan National Defense Strategy Commission, on which I had the privilege to serve. Most relevant to today's hearing, I reaffirm the NDS Commission's endorsement of the 2018 National Defense Strategy, as well as the recommendation of a 3 to 5% real growth annum increase in the DoD budget. The Biden administration's FY22 budget request falls short of what is required to support the National Defense Strategy. The $715 billion request represents a real cut as it fails to keep pace with inflation. This departs significantly with the NDS Commission's recommendation of this 3 to 5% real growth that was generally viewed as the minimum necessary to sustain the NDS and keep pace with both current and future threats. The FY22 budget is below the $37 billion we required to get 3% and $52 billion below what it would get you to the 5% growth. Indeed, both represent substantial sums of money. But given the strategic environment, as well as resources our government is spending on other priorities, it is a prudent investment towards sustaining our peace and prosperity. This was true in 2019 when the Commission issued its recommendation. It's even more critical today with inflationary forces on the rise. Now there are some, including thoughtful voices on this committee, who reject the NDS Commission recommendation on the grounds that it fails to make real strategic choices or come to terms with fiscal realities. To those skeptics, I would point to the NDS Commission's recommendation, an admonition really, that anything short of this recommendation will require the Pentagon to, quote, alter the expectations of the U.S. defense strategy and our global strategic objectives. In other words, the choice is really binary. We either need to resource the strategy or change that strategy. If this Congress will not fund the current national defense strategy, then our civilian and military leaders owe you a new strategy that reduces our military missions and global posture. In my view, changing the strategy in such a manner would have a detrimental and dramatic effect on our national security. And the best I can discern from the Biden administration's nascent strategy and the first budget request is that military missions and mandates will increase, not shrink. As the Congress considers the defense budget, it ought to consider the conduct of its primary competitor, the Chinese Communist Party. The White House's interim national security strategic guidance rightly reaffirmed the Trump administration's assertion that the United States faces, quote, a growing rivalry with the more assertive and authoritarian China. And Secretary Austin correctly described before this committee the Chinese Communist Party's People Liberation Army as, quote, the pacing threat. In March of this year, Beijing announced a 6.8% increase in its defense spending despite the economic toll of the pandemic. And recent analysis reveals the annual dollar value of the PLA procurement is on course to eclipse that of the United States military by 2024. If this occurs, then by 2030, the United States will no longer boast the world's most advanced fighting force in total inventory value. This spending allows the CCP to fund an active force of 2 million and a Navy which commissions about 14 ships each year, including a new cutting-edge aircraft carrier. As the Pentagon's China Military Power Report outlined, the CCP is on its way to becoming, quote, a world-class military by marshaling the resources, technology, and political will to which over the past 2 decades has allowed them to strengthen and modernize the PLA in nearly every respect. Advocates of a strong U.S. national security posture often invoke President Reagan's peace through strength philosophy. But it's worth reflecting on the meaning of that core principle. At the height of the 1980s military buildup, President Reagan argued, peace is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to cope with conflict by peaceful means. Now, while this hearing is nominally about the defense budget, at its core, it is a debate about strategy. And the choices before you are clear. Option one, resourcing a strategy that would seek to prevail in the competition with China while holding off adversaries and spoilers in other regions. Option two, maintaining that strategy, but not resourcing it adequately and absorbing risk. Option three, as was laid out, more dramatically choosing a more modest strategy that would cede our military supremacy and really shrink to a regional power. The choice will determine the nature of our peace and the likelihood of us prevailing in conflict. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I appreciate all the testimony. So as I look at this, I mean, there's clear consensus on one point, and that is that, strategy and the resources have been a bit misaligned for a little while. And then the question is, do we change the strategy? Do we change the resources? And a lot of what's driving this is, I think, what Ms. Pettyjohn focused on, which is, Russia and China. Could we go to, the Baltic states, the Balkans, and win a war with Russia? Could we go to Taiwan and win a war with China? So put that aside for the moment. We have a wide range of other national security interests. We're still dealing with transnational terrorist threats. The great power competition is taking place in many instances in Africa, in Latin America, and elsewhere. It's not just in Russia, in China and Eastern Europe. So there's a wide range of things we're trying to do. And also, as we've seen, global pandemics are definitely a threat to our national security. Climate change is definitely a threat to our national security. So we got all that stuff over here that we're doing. But it seems to me that the construct that I find, struggle with, that I don't necessarily agree with, is we have to be able to win an all-out war with China. We have to be able to win an all-out war with Russia. That seems to be what's driving the requirements. And I don't think there is any fiscal way to guarantee that, because China and Russia, they are big powers. If that's our mission, then yes, we ought to have a defense budget that's a lot bigger than it currently is. I think it is an unachievable mission past a certain point, and it is also unnecessary. We have to be able to deter China and Russia. But to think that we have to build our military in an era when China more than Russia, they're rising up economically. Our post-Cold War utter and complete dominance just simply wasn't going to last. It's not the way the world works. Other countries will get up off the ground and begin growing and building. So we've basically set up, we're chasing our tail here, trying to be able to defeat them in a war on the road, basically. That's not necessary, okay? We need to be able to deter them. And by the way, the military is not the only way to deter adversaries from doing things that we don't want. But once you set that premise up, Once you say China and Russia are terrible, awful, and doing all of these things, we have to stop them. And the only way to stop them is to be prepared to win an all-out war. Well, then, yeah, you may as well push the button to infinity on how much money we can spend on defense. So I guess I'll start with Ms. Pettyjohn as an answer to this question. Why do we have to win an all-out war with China and Russia? Why isn't, I mean, adversaries far smaller than us have successfully deterred us for years for a heck of a lot less money. Why can't we do the same thing with China and Russia and not buy into this, like, endless expense?
Thank you for that question. I agree that competition with China and Russia spans the whole spectrum of government, and that actually other departments and agencies should take the lead in the peacetime competition that's going on. But what the Department of Defense does and does best is deter wars. And you don't deter wars by hoping that you have the capability to stop them. You actually need to have the forces to prevent them from achieving their objective, what we call deterrence by denial.
Just focus my question a little bit on that. What you have to be able to do is you have to make sure that your adversary decides that there's too much pain involved in starting the conflict. It's not a matter necessarily of winning. It's a matter of they look at this and say, okay, maybe I can win, but it's going to be too high a price. Am I wrong about that?
Correct. You need to change their calculus where they wonder whether they can win or if they're willing to bear the costs. And what it sounds like you're suggesting a punishment strategy, which one could rely on, but the sort of gold standard of deterrence is deterrence by denial. And it doesn't require infinite resources and capabilities. You focus on specific missions that are related to the particular threat and scenario that you're focusing on. And if you narrow it down, it is something that our analysis suggests that we can do, where we can build a force that is capable of deterring by denial.
What specifically aren't we spending money on now that in your analysis, do we need more aircraft carriers, we need more ships, we need more planes? What aren't we spending money on that could get us to this magical place of complete deterrence?
It's not complete deterrence. Deterrence is always, a process and something that is in the eye of the beholder. In the near term, I think the biggest areas where we could improve are long-range munitions of various types. There are some of these in the FY22 budget, but not enough, in my opinion. Anti-ship missiles, anti-radiation missiles, anti-armor area effects weapons, and they make the capabilities that we have much more effective. We also could improve the resiliency of our forces through relatively inexpensive measures in terms of passive defenses on the bases that we have. As we look forward, I think we do need to invest in emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and autonomy and use those capabilities to help to ensure that we retain this edge over the long run, whether it's for conducting all domain operations or and just to reduce our personnel costs, which are one of the biggest parts of the defense budget.
Yeah, thanks. And just quickly, Roger, go ahead and comment on that.
Mr. Chairman, I always enjoyed discussing this question. I would just add to Dr. Pettyjohn's list by adding undersea capabilities. And I think part of the national defense strategy got wrong is that it was ambiguous in terms of what we are trying to deter and specifically where we are trying to prevail. No one's looking to invade mainland China, at least I'm not aware of it. But if you're looking at a Taiwan scenario, for example, there are real things we have to do, and we can wrap our arms around that in terms of real budget priorities by emphasizing the list that was just outlined by my colleague, and I would add undersea capabilities there as well.
Thanks. Ms. Smithberger, do you have any comment?
And the only other thing I would emphasize is, as you were saying in your remarks, I think we need to be focusing on hardening our systems when it comes to cybersecurity risks as well. I think that's where we have dividends in helping our whole economy.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have never met Dr. Pettyjohn before, but I like the way she thinks. I agree with her opening statement and the answers to her questions, so I'm going to leave her alone. I got no place to go but down. when it comes to what she was saying. Roger Zakheim, do you believe the president's budget request is sufficient to prevail in a conflict with China?
I do not, Mr. Chairman.
And
Mr.
Ms.
Ranking Member,
Smithberger,
excuse me.
I like the way it sounds, though. Go ahead. Ms. Smithberger, you made the comment that you, and I understand there are a lot of critics of the LCS. It's on both ends of the Capitol. But you made the point that you thought it should have been a project that was killed earlier. But we've been talking here about the real threat in Taiwan, with China trying to militarily take control. Were that to happen, what would we do in those shallow waters if we didn't have the LCS? What other option would there be?
So I think what we learned very early in the LCS program is that a lot of our assumptions about how it was going to function weren't going to work, that we weren't getting the kinds of manning concepts that we were expecting to have, that we weren't getting the kind of survivability and reliability. So it's not that it's not a capability that we need, but that this was not a platform that was actually serving our needs.
So you don't think it would have achieved that goal in shallow waters around Taiwan with its shortcomings? Is that what I'm hearing?
That is something I have concerns about, particularly, I think, across the platforms that we're buying, when we have so much complexity, that we're not having the kind of reliability that we need to be as lethal as we should be.
Yeah, and I agree with that observation, but until we get it, I think we've got to have that platform because what we're hearing from our COCOMs is pretty ominous, particularly when it comes to that area, and I think it's imminent. So I think we have to be able to use that capability until we've got something better to replace it. You heard the chairman, Mr. Zakheim, make the point that we've either got to alter our strategy or alter our spending. Do you believe we have the right strategy now? And if not, what's the alternative?
I believe the 2018 National Defense Strategy is the right strategy. The Pentagon, as was outlined by me and others here, needs to do a better job of executing against that strategy, both in terms of the operational concepts that would develop it and the resources and capabilities that we're discussing here. I agree with the chairman that if you aren't willing to resource that strategy, then come up with an alternative. My own view is that we got it right in 2018, and we need to execute.
Great. That's all I got, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think for Dr. Pettyjohn, on the budget, is it an way to put it? Is this an everything problem, or is it the right investment we need in talent, in people, in skills, or emerging technology, or is it surface ships? Is it subsurface ships? Is it aviation? Is it an everything problem with the budget, or are there gaps in your view in the defense budget based on your exercises that you said, we ought to be doing X but not Y, more of X and less of Y?
Thank you. It's not an everything problem. There are gaps, and there are a lot of things that I think are worth commending within this budget. There just need to be further shifts to bring it in a line with a high-end deterrence strategy, which would be consistent largely with the 2018 NDS if that's the direction the Biden administration goes in. They need to continue to, as my colleague on the panel suggested, expand undersea capabilities, invest in unmanned systems for the future, next generation air dominance, figuring out how they are going to develop intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance systems to operate in highly contested and denied environments. Some people have ideas for autonomous networks of mesh UAVs that would do this, or perhaps you need a penetrating ISR aircraft. But that is a critical piece of helping the service to close kill chains, in addition to buying a lot more munitions than we have. If we have the right munitions on a lot of the platforms that we have today, they're much more effective.
Yeah. Thank you. Ms. Smithberger, your testimony is more of a criticism, which is all legit, but on the same question, where do you think we ought to be investing in the budget?
I would agree with a number of the areas that some of my colleagues have emphasized, but I think a lot of what we focus on is really how are these systems acquired, and I think we just want to make sure that we are doing this in a way that we are buying systems that are going to be reliable and serving our needs. I think the department has had a lot of trouble acquiring technology over the years, that it's made it difficult for us to have the kind of insights that we want to have.
Yeah. Thinking ahead, I'm not trying to make the ranking member's argument, but let's assume that the budget's too low and that we need to invest in sort of things that we don't want to invest in order to get to where we want to be. Anyone on the panel believe that Congress would allow, after we achieve that magical state, anyone on the panel believe that Congress would allow us to cut the things that we are our legacy? Roger, I'm sorry, Mr. Zakheim.
Congressman,
because I don't. But
I'll know better than to opine on what the Congress would and would not allow for. That's based on some years working for members like you. But I do think you have a better shot that when you take platforms out of the inventory, there's a real capability you can point to that you will replace it with. And I think the problem we're facing, and I know the chairman doesn't like the language of legacy systems, which I agree with, is that we talk about capabilities we want to remove, and we don't have a clear idea of what is going to take its place. And if we do, it often only exists on a PowerPoint slide. I think if we can get after that problem, you might have more support in this body for those changes.
I would note in your testimony, in footnote 18 on your PowerPoint slide, note you said, rarely does the Pentagon deliver the replacement on time or on cost, which is actually the problem that we're faced with. Not that it's on a PowerPoint slide. That should have been the headline in your testimony.
Congressman, I'm heartened that the footnotes were read, especially by a member of Congress. But
be careful about what you put in footnotes.
Well, no, and I stand by it. But the reality is, for all the problems the Pentagon has with doing things on time and well, it's the best we've got in the U.S. government, and it's the only pathway we have.
All right. I had other questions, and I apologize for not getting to them. I would just note that I've made this point before. My definition of a legacy system is something that the Pentagon doesn't want to do, but Congress won't let them stop doing it.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Wilson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome back, Roger Zakheim. Thank the other witnesses too, but you need to be aware Roger was a very effective staff person here, advising many of us on key issues and making such a positive difference. And so we're very happy for your success to be director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, and I'm confident you'll bring the same level of success as you have from your service here. With that, a question for you, and that is the Biden administration budget request continues the trend of biasing air and naval resources at the cost of the Army, despite the reality that any near-peer conflict would be all domain. If left unchanged, the Biden budget request would force another cut of 1,000 soldiers to the Army's active duty force and cancel 9 combat training center rotations. If this trend continues as a result of the inadequate top lines, what are the likely consequences to Army readiness?
Thank you, Congressman, and it's great to be with you. Always enjoy sitting behind you and bantering during a hearing. You know, you're hitting on a key point, which is the so-called choices they have to make in this budget because of the ceiling on the top line is going to take end strength and capability out, particularly the Army. And I'll make 2 points here, Mr. Wilson. Number one, you know, this is something that we all experienced during the operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, where at that point, whatever reason, we did not have end strength to sustain what the President of the United States needed. Now, nobody wants to get into another Iraq and Afghanistan, and I think the culture and wisdom is one that we should avoid that at all costs. But to at least have an Army that could deploy if you need it and sustain it in such a fashion that we're not asking too much of those who serve, I think is a responsible approach. A 3 to 5% growth would allow you perhaps to maintain that number. The second thing I'd say, and then I'll wrap up, is the Chairman of Joint Chiefs before this committee said that the budget has a bias toward future operating environment. And I think this committee needs to unpack those words, which is we're absorbing risk in the near and midterm through this request, and in some ways it reflects the concern you outlined in your question.
And thank you for that response. And I'm very grateful to represent the training facilities of Fort Jackson, and I know what great work is done there to protect American families. And Mr. Zakheim, there is bipartisan commitment that countering China's military buildup, the largest peacetime military buildup in history, this requires historic investment in the Pacific theater, yet the Biden defense budget halves INDOPACOM's top priority, reducing the crucial missile defense system to protect Guam, to protect American families of the patriotic American territory. It also omits funding for the Hawaii Homeland Defense Radar. It appears that the Pacific Defense Initiative funding in this budget request fails to adequately fund critical joint and enabling capabilities and instead prioritizes platform-centric procurement that should be funded elsewhere in the budget. How should the committee redirect this Pacific Deterrence Initiative spending, provided that the budget requests to ensure it meets the threats?
Thanks for that question. First, this committee, the chairman and the ranking member, really deserves a lot of credit for pushing the Pacific Defense Initiative. PDI is something that, classic case where the Congress put forward an important project and the Pentagon adopted it. In terms of what the Pentagon was thinking by not funding those key priorities, like you've highlighted Guam and Hawaii and missile defense there, it could be they were betting that the Congress would do it for them and they could shoehorn in other programs that they thought they might not have room for in the budget. I'm sure the members here have seen that once or twice in previous requests, and it happens both in Republican and Democratic administrations. Short answer is, Mr. Wilson, I would recommend maintaining what the administration requested and making sure we have those investments to protect Guam and Hawaii.
And I'd like to point out that you've already indicated that the 2018 National Defense Strategy should be followed through to address the instability that we see around the world, whether it be the instability, the hasty withdrawal, the potential for mass slaughter in Afghanistan. We've got the circumstance of China expanding its influence in the South China Sea, threatening Taiwan, and then Russia, sadly, occupying parts of Moldova and Georgia and occupying parts of Ukraine with 14,000 persons killed. We need to be ever vigilant, and I want to thank you for your efforts, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Langevin is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony today. Particularly, Mr. Zakheim, great to see you again. I appreciate the work that you do at the Reagan Institute. Let me begin on an issue that's important to our national security relating to climate change. So in last year's NDAA, we directed the DOD to update its 2014 climate change adaptation roadmap and include an implementation plan to mitigate 9 previously identified effects that extreme weather and rising sea levels will have on military installations. So this plan would address changing energy demands, installation resilience, and the resilience of strategic assets. So, Ms. Smithberger, how could a climate change adaptation and implementation plan reduce the DOD's financial pressure?
That's a great question. So I think this is going to be pivotal. We already are seeing the billions of dollars in costs that we are seeing to our different installations by not adequately addressing climate change. So I think this is one of the instrumental areas where the department really needs to be planning for the future, because these are the last things that we want to be losing money on. We want to be, prioritizing as many dollars as possible to our capabilities and not to rebuilding things that we could have protected.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And for the record, I really do applaud the department for its plan to release a climate change plan soon, but it still needs to update the adaptation roadmap and provide an implementation plan so that we can act now to mitigate the effects of extreme weather down the road. So I want to look at another area. I see a disturbing trend that really deeply concerns me on research and development spending. So in 1996, the U.S. spent $8 for every $1 that Russia and China spent on research and development. Now, we outspend our adversaries by 6 cents. So while I'm happy that the administration is investing in R&D with the highest funding level to date, I have to say that I'm disappointed that within that top line, we've actually cut basic and applied R&D accounts. That's that early stage research that done, for example, at DARPA and also at colleges and universities. So Dr. Pettyjohn, should we invest more in early stage research, and if so, by how much? And what are the effects of not properly funding R&D?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. Yes, I think we do need to be investing in R&D, and in particular science and technology, which are the most advanced capabilities. It will lead to that. So that is incredibly important for the department as it looks to the future. And the department also needs to work on continuing with the process that's been underway in terms of reforming acquisition and potentially even the PPE process, so that it can better tap into the private sector where a lot of this research is undergoing as well, and bring in new capabilities at speed and scale, overcoming the valley of death problem that exists today.
Sure. Dr. Zakheim, did you want to add something?
Just real quick, I agree with what's been said, but it happens to be what you're focusing on, those S&T accounts, the basic research, is where the private sector is not operating. Right? That is fundamentally the place where government is able to make investments and are willing to take some risk in a way that private entities will not be able to do, because it's too much risk and unsure whether they'll be able to return a profit. So I think you're right to highlight this reduction, because no one else will do it.
Yeah. In addition to that, though, I would say that if private sector knew that government would be purchasers of the capabilities that they would develop, I think they would be more likely to venture into those areas, which would help get and buy commercial off the shelf, while at the same time supporting private sector R&D enhanced capabilities.
Completely agree.
So thank you for that input. Ms. Smithberger, in your testimony, you mentioned that newer weapon systems are too expensive to upgrade and will quickly become irrelevant legacies. How can building open software architecture systems avoid costly upgrades? I think we're too hardware-centric right now, and we really do need to be more software-centric, but what is your perspective?
I think that is a major opportunity for us to be able to have cost savings to encourage competition down the line, and for us to take as many market forces as possible to help reduce costs.
Very good. I'm not going to have time to get to my next question, so at this point I'll yield back and I'll submit the other one for the record, but thank you all for your testimony. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Lambert is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zakheim, it's great to see you, and I remember when your father would testify here in committee. So like father, like son.
I hope so, but thank you for that.
My colleague and friend Joe Wilson already did a great job of addressing the needs with the West in Pacific. The Indo-Pacific region is something that the last 3 administrations, including this one, are now concentrating more on, but we're not really funding everything that's required. And he mentioned some examples of what is not being funded. But do you think we could be doing a better job of working to make sure that Taiwan, which is probably a flashpoint, if there is one anywhere in the world, of potential for World War III, you know, God forbid. It's one of several flashpoints. That we can do a better job of partnering with them so that they could at least give a credible, if not prevent completely, at least prevent a huge cost deterrent to China for any kind of threatened invasion.
Thank you, Congressman. Short answer to your question is yes. And this,
what would that specifically be?
Sure. First, I think it's not just hard power, but it's a soft power too. Very important for the Biden administration to continue to support Taiwan in terms of policy statements and the like. On the military side, you got to be cognizant of what Admiral Davidson said, that this is a near-term problem. Someone on this committee has characterized this as the Davidson window. And so making sure that we have capability today, and we're not taking capability out of our Navy, and that's present. It's kind of peacetime missions, but we know this is the center of gravity for the competition, is the key piece that we need to invest in. So making sure our assets are present in the region and making sure we're exercising in the region, demonstrating that we have the capability and the will to defend Taiwan should such a scenario be required, but most importantly, to convince the Chinese Communist Party that they shouldn't exploit this window that Admiral Davidson shared with this community?
Well, I want to be real specific about how we actually get that job done. Ms. Pettyjohn talked about long-range munitions. I think that that's a piece of the puzzle. You've mentioned earlier underwater capabilities. I think that's a piece of the puzzle. But what about anti-ship mining technology? Can we do better there? Anti-ship missiles, can we do better there? And short-range air power.
I think all of that is important. I mean, the anti-access aerial denial issue has only become more complicated since the time I had the chance to work with you when I was on the staff of this committee. It's one that's quite a complicated thicket. Our fighter aircraft is challenged in a Taiwan scenario. That's no secret. We need to be able to have long-range munitions to deter any Chinese aggression there. So all the things you've outlined are spot on. But I want to emphasize it's so important that this is not something we're communicating that we can handle in 5 years' time or 7 years' time outside the FIDIP. We need to demonstrate we have the will and capability today. And a budget that we put forward before this committee needs to reflect that too.
And lastly, changing gears entirely, NATO and Russia. Can we be doing a better job of providing to our partners and allies in Europe, Eastern and Western Europe, what it takes to give a huge, credible deterrent against an aggressive Russia?
Yeah. Congressman, I'm glad you raised Russia. It seems to be the far second, and it should be kind of a closer second in conversations, particularly in this window that I'm discussing. Yes, there seems to be this kind of incongruence between allies that have the will but don't have the capability, and allies that have, let's say, the capability or the means but don't have the will to defend themselves. And that's really the challenge with the NATO. Poland should be able to have land-based capabilities that we sell them. We need to do more with the Balts in the same vein. There are foreign military sales opportunities that hopefully this administration will deliver for those allies willing to defend themselves. And then, of course, particularly when it comes to Russia, exercises, joint exercises in that region are a very important message and form of deterrence.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Khanna is recognized. Is he here? You need to unmute yourself, Mr. Khanna. At least that's what my staff is telling me. Actually, I don't think we have Mr. Khanna. I think I misinformed there. So Ms. Slotkin is recognized for 5 minutes.
Pardon. I apologize.
I have it here.
Oh.
Sorry. A voice from beyond. Mr. Khanna, you are with us.
Yes, I've been here. Was I on mute?
Yeah. I believe you were. But you are now recognized for 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. Mr. Chairman, thank you for convening this hearing. I would like to start by noting that, we have one person from the Reagan Institute who wants an increase in the defense budget. Another witness was saying, well, we want more money, not calling for an increase specifically, and only one really witness who is calling for a decrease. So I hope for future hearings that we will have a greater diversity.
Yield for just one moment.
Sure.
Sorry, well, just for the record, that was not our intent. Okay. This played out a little bit differently than I expected it to.
I mean, of course.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We're pausing your time. I'll just get through this. I can't exactly say how that played out, but it was not our expectation. Our expectation actually was to have one person who said we could reduce it, one person said we increase it, one person to defend President Biden's budget. We had a heck of a time finding anyone to defend President Biden's budget, just as you would have had a heck of a time finding anyone to defend President Trump's budget. Nobody. I've been through 4 presidents in 25 years. Nobody ever supports the budget that you actually have to write down. okay? You know, we could all theoretically talk about this, that, and the other stuff, but if you're the unfortunate soul who has to actually put it in writing, you know, we've done this back and forth. You know, nobody has ever defended any president's budget. So for the new Republicans on the committee, you think, oh, see, that proves that Biden's budget is terrible. No, it proves that every single president's budget, because it actually has to be written down, it has to add up, you have to have the details, you don't have all of that comfortable gray space to play around in, gets more difficult. So it was our hope to have this be more balanced, and I do apologize to the committee for not having achieved that. But it was not our intent for this to play out the way it did. But that's why we've got you, Ro. you can carry all the weight on the other side right now. So we will restart your time.
Chairman, I have great respect. I have great respect for your integrity and your leadership, and I certainly don't want to imply that you or the staff would not have a balanced hearing. That was not my intent. My intent is just that, you know, somehow we don't agree on the president's budgets, but the defense budget keeps going up and up and up. It's sort of like the law of gravity, an immutable rule in Washington, other than when President Clinton was there and President Bush Sr. And I do think there are many organizations who are about strategic ways of reducing the defense while maintaining a strong national security. But let me begin with Mr. Zakheim. Mr. Zakheim, I appreciate your testimony. I read your statement very carefully. What was President Reagan's budget inflation adjusted at the peak of the Cold War for defense?
Well, what I have here in my notes is in 1985, it was about 5.7% of GDP. That's the best I can answer you now.
Yes.
Go ahead, sir. Sorry.
It was 610 billion inflation adjusted. That would be 110 billion. And one of the things, I disagree very strongly with President Reagan, but one of the things I often say is that he confronted challenges that were unprecedented with the Cold War and had a huge challenge of national security. Do you really believe that we have more national security challenges today than President Reagan confronted in 1985?
I do, sir, and here's why. The challenge with the Soviet Union, best I can understand, was fundamentally a military challenge. We have a similar military challenge facing the Chinese Communist Party. But what the Chinese Communist Party has that the Soviet Union does not have or did not have is this overwhelming economy that is rivaling and will potentially outpace the U.S. economy. So they have the combination of economic power and military power that the Soviet Union did not possess. In fact, as you know,
all right.
Go ahead, sir.
Let me just, I don't want to cut you off because I have time and I would love to engage in the conversation more broadly. I disagree that China poses a more serious military threat than the Soviet Union did in the 1980s. I think George Shultz would disagree. Unfortunately, he's passed with that. Economically, I agree with you, but I think to think that China either is spending as much militarily as the Soviet Union was or poses a greater threat with than what the Soviet Union did, I think is to underestimate actually what President Reagan confronted. But it's a longer conversation. I just do want to point out that the budget is about 110 billion more than it was at the peak and height of the Cold War. And, you know, I want to turn to Miss Mandy Smithberger because you've done a lot of work. You're very helpful with our TransDime hearing where we had a company that was basically ripping off taxpayers in a bipartisan way with the chairman's leadership, with at the time Representative Meadows and Representative Jordan's leadership. We got them to pay back $16 million to the U.S. government because they were monopolizing industry parts and then charging 1,000% more to the American taxpayers. Could you talk about the defense contractors? People often say, where can we cut? And I agree. Look, there are people on the committee who disagree with my view on not needing to modernize nuclear weapons. But could you talk about the place where we can cut, which is that defense contractors, the CEOs there make $20 million a year. They're not the ones wearing the uniform risking their lives. You know, it's like, reminds me of All My Sons, you know, the Arthur Miller novel. The people who are making the money aren't the ones risking their lives. There are a lot of members on this committee, honorable members who risk their lives. I have tremendous admiration for them. But the defense contractors making $20 million a year, CEOs, average executive, $5 million a year. Why can't we cut that? It's outrageous. And how much would we save?
So we could save tens of billions of dollars if we reduced our reliance on what we refer to as the shadow workforce or service contractors. And I think if we had a goal of trying to acquire systems that are less complex, that are easier to maintain so that our own personnel can maintain them, that we would be both more lethal and more effective as a consequence. And in the TransDigm instance, I would say that we really do need to strengthen our acquisition laws so that taxpayers don't continue to get ripped off, that we want to make sure that when something is considered a commercial item that is truly commercial, that is sold in like quantities on the market, in too many instances, suddenly something is characterized as commercial, and then the price goes up 100%, and we're not able to challenge that information to make sure that we are paying a fair price. These are small things that add up, and these are not areas that we should be wasting money.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Whitman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us today. Mr. Zakheim, I'd like to start with you. I look at this year's FY22 budget and see that all four of the service branches have a reduction in end strength. And listen, we know the Air Force, because of personnel moving over to Space Force, their reduction is smaller, but they still have exacerbated issues with pilots and maintainers to make sure they have what they need. The Marine Corps has kind of accepted a smaller and leaner force, but listen, the Commandant still, I think, speaks about how the Marine Corps has to reconstitute itself in order to make sure they're relevant in the areas that they need to be today. We talk all the time about a Navy that has to grow in capability and capacity, yet we see a shorting of at-sea billets in the Navy. So, you know, we're seeing the two curves going in different directions. More platforms, fewer people operating those platforms. We see that exacerbated with collisions and also the problem of burning out our most talented with long deployments, and we've seen double pumping deployments. I mean, I can go on and on about those particular issues. And up until this year, the Army's billets continue to grow. So the question is in relation to what we face, the challenges in the Indo-Pacific, are the budget priorities right with where we are in reducing end strength in these different areas? Are we truly tailoring our forces based on end strength for the next fight? And do we maybe need a little more drastic resource reallocation based on us, you know, still hanging over from a CENTCOM-centric directive that the Department of Defense has continued to put in place for now almost 2 decades?
Yeah, Congressman, great question. I think when it comes to the CENTCOM-centric mentality, it's one that this committee, I know, has exercised oversight over, and it needs to continue. And that plays out both on the issues you've outlined in terms of the demand for ground forces, for example, versus investing in end strength across the Marine Corps, Navy, and Air Force, as you've outlined. And of course, it's not limited to that. ISR requirements, the movement of assets, aircraft carrier comes to mind, out of Indo-PACOM into CENTCOM, all that needs to be revisited, and it's an area of the national defense strategy that the Pentagon has not done enough work on, which is not how do we reduce our presence or capability in the Middle East, for example, how do we do it differently so the high-end assets go to Indo-PACOM? And I think that is, you know, I would align with what you're saying and highlight that point.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Zakheim. I want to now talk a little bit more in depth about the issue of the total picture of our nation's defense. President Eisenhower once said, "You will not find it difficult to prove that battles, campaigns, and even wars have been won or lost primarily because of logistics." You know, we all get focused on combat systems and all those fancy elements, but in order to make things work, you know, logistics is key. We have a regular Army now nearing 481,000 soldiers, and there is not a proper sea lift capacity. So if you have the best Army in the world and you can't get them to the fight, the question is are we really doing the things necessary to achieve our strategic goals to deter China? And I know that sea lift is technically a Navy requirement, but the Navy never really has been interested in that. It's kind of like, hey, we're in the warship business. You know, we're going to be at the fight. We really don't care how everybody else gets to the fight. And I'm just being brutally honest about what I think things are. The question now becomes, shouldn't the Army be a little more involved in advocating to say, whoa, wait a minute, what are we doing about logistics? What are we doing about making sure that we can get to the fight, that we have our soldiers at the fight, that we have our equipment at the fight? Because it seems like, everybody's pointing fingers at each other. Logistics is yours, sea lift is yours, airlift is yours, and nobody seems to really be focused on it, yet the service branch is at most at risk, to me, is the Army. Can you comment on that?
I think it's a great point. When I was on the NDS Commission, the most impactful briefing didn't come from Central Command, didn't come from, at the time, PACOM, it came from Transcom.
Yeah.
Because as you pointed out, they have to figure out how to get our capability to the fight. That's why forward presence is so important.
Yeah.
But I think, yes, I agree with you. I think the Army needs to internalize it, but Transcom is where I would go. And in the end, we rely on contractors to do this. I mean, as you know, it's something that the military departments have looked outside the force to answer.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Carbajal is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today. When I came to Congress, I was appalled at how little comprehensive audits had been done for the department over the years. And oftentimes, over the years, I would hear about all these skirmishes about wanting to get audits for various agencies for the federal government. And it was just appalling for me to hear all the spending we do in our military, but yet we weren't as committed to making sure all our spending was being done in the most appropriate way. So it did catch my attention. And Ms. Smithberger, with the department having undergone its third annual audit in 2020, I would like to know from your independent analysis the most important lessons learned so far. In addition, could you speak further to the recommendation in your testimony on how the department can make changes to service contracting that would result in cost savings without compromising military readiness? And I know you touched on that a little bit, but if you could elaborate a little bit more, that would be great.
Thank you so much for the question. So on the audit, I think one of the things that we are learning is that we actually have very weak internal controls, that we are not always able to keep track of everything that we've purchased. And I think a theme that we've seen throughout this hearing is that we focus so much on platforms that we often forget about the other management issues that need to be a priority at the department to make sure that we're being responsible stewards of taxpayer dollars. When it comes to service contracting, one of the biggest challenges that we have is that we actually don't track the data about how much we spend on service contracts, and we haven't set up a good process for the department to make smart decisions about when to outsource something versus when to do something else. And never mind having a process, what if we just shouldn't do it, period? I think the other thing that we're seeing over and over is that we're asking the department to do too much, and I'd be happy to work with you on some of the ways where we thought the Army was doing a lot of great work on helping to build systems where we could make smarter decisions about service contracting, and unfortunately, those have really fallen apart.
Thank you. I would submit that as committed as we all are to our national security, we are remiss in not being as committed to making sure that we have more accountability and transparency in how we go about our spending. So I really appreciate your feedback. Dr. Pettyjohn, what are the most important investments in fiscal year 22 budget that provide assurances to our allies?
There are a number of investments that provide assurances to our allies, and I think you have to think of assurance as across time, not just immediately. Our allies have become accustomed to the fact that we assure them by being there with bases or military forces that rotate forward. And we are doing that, and we're taking steps in the FY22 budget to improve the resiliency and capabilities of the posture in Europe to a lesser extent than I would like to see in the Pacific as well. But our allies should also be assured by the fact that we're taking steps to modernize and to put in place a force that would be able to prevail in a conflict should one occur, because that strengthens deterrence. Having forces that are not capable that are forward have been shown what is often called a tripwire are not actually effective deterrents. So there are a number of steps that we're taking here that should be quite reassuring to our allies.
Thank you, Mr. Zakheim.
Just quick addition, sir. Resiliency, right? Distributing the force, so not pocketing it in one area. And I think our nuclear modernization is key. The extended deterrence we provide both to our allies in Europe and in Asia is critical for assurance.
Thank you. Dr. Pettyjohn, in your perspective, how can fiscal year 22 budget better balance the needs to preserve present readiness with long-term goals, including investments in emerging technologies? In addition, are there any programs or areas that you think the department is over-investing in?
Thank you, Congressman. I do think preserving readiness is important. You've heard Generals Berger and Brown argue that we need to shift our mindset about readiness. We obviously don't want a force that is not prepared for the potential missions that it might be called on to fight. But we've gotten in the habit of considering ready forces ready to deploy and sending them on purely presence missions or to the Middle East to deal with insurgents or terrorists. And as we look to focus on great power competitors,
I do apologize.
Like
the gentleman's
Russia,
time has expired, so we will move on
Sure.
to Mr. Kelly, who's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all you witnesses for being here. I just want to go back to an earlier point that you made, Mr. Zakheim. China is much more dangerous, in my opinion, than Russia ever was. And it's not just because of their economy. It's also because of their diplomatic efforts. Russia never had good allies that weren't forced to be allies. China is doing a much better job at least trying to incorporate allies. We're still way ahead in that game, but China is improving. Information, which is part of the dime, they also are very far advanced in that area, much farther and greater, I think, than Russia was in the height of the Soviet Union. Also their military and obviously their economic. I do want to talk just a little bit. In this budget, the President's budget, there's $617 million for climate change. I am a climate change, I'm all for climate change, but not in the military budget. That is $617 million. It does not go to building ships, to research and development, to paying soldiers, to maintaining equipment. So do you consider that part of the defense budget when it's not for defense?
Thanks for that question. I don't know specifically where that $600 million is going. I do think it's important, like we think about the case of the Arctic, that if climate change is having an impact there, which it is, that our military needs to be ready to make that another area for the competition. It's clear that's where Russia is seeking to exploit. That, to me, is an important nexus point between climate change and the U.S. military. Last point on climate change, sir, it's a new mission. It's one that this administration wants to emphasize, and so we need to be clear in terms of how that's going to impact policy and budgets.
And I'm fine with doing that. I just think the defense budget is not the place to do that. There are other places. I want to talk a little bit. We've always fought the last war, been prepared to fight the last war. If you go back to World War II, World War I, we didn't want to use tanks, we didn't want to use planes because they were unproven. We just wanted to use grunts on the ground. If you go back, World War II, we had all these great battleships, but we were not prepared for the carrier war. If you look, every one we transfer. And so my question is, we have to be ready and prepared to fight tonight. That's maintaining legacy systems, the systems we have. We cannot divesting those until we have a true product that replaces them. I see right now we're managing that risk, but I think people are talking about the future, about things that we may have but we don't have yet. We have to build real ships, real airplanes, real drones, all those things. But we're talking about concepts that people aren't doing. So are we really preparing for the future? Are we investing in the right things? Are we replacing systems? Are we replacing them when we have something to replace them with? Or are we replacing them with ideas that may or may not come to fruition?
I agree with those comments, sir. And I think you have to, I'll bring up General Milley's testimony for this committee that this budget has a bias towards future operating environments. That is to say that they're going to absorb risk. This budget absorbs risk in the near term. And when you think about the Davidson window, that could be a strategic mistake on our part, because that may be where the Chinese Communist Party would seek to exploit. And if they do seek to exploit in that window, we're going to need the types of capabilities that are in the inventory today. And we ought to be careful not to remove them unless, as you point out, there's something else that can be in the inventory to replace it.
And the final point I just want to make is I think we have to be prepared to fight today. I think that is necessary. But I also think we have got to redo the way we acquire stuff in the military. We acquire ideas. We need to go after capabilities, be very specific, and we need professional contract lawyers, not generals, running the acquisition program who take them to task and make them, if they say they're going to deliver this for X dollars, then they deliver that, or either we don't pay the contract. But we also owe a duty to our industrial base that when we ask them to do something and commit for them to build something, we can't then withdraw the contract and lay people off by the thousands because we changed our mind or we want something new and more shiny. So how can we reinvent the acquisition system to get professionals who are doing the contracts, who get us the products that we want and deserve at the cost that we agree to?
Well, I'm going to channel President Reagan here. Competition is the only thing that increases quality, all right, and increases quantity, right, with the price going down. That's where I would go follow.
Thank you. Ms. Slotkin.
Thanks to the witnesses for being here. Mr. Zakheim, good to see you again. I guess if you can help me understand, you're calling for this 3 to 5% increase in the top line. Can you fill in, show your math a little bit? Where did that number come from? What's the basis of that?
Thank you. It's great to see you, Representative Slotkin. It's from General Dunford and Secretary Mattis, and it was actually their testimony before this committee what was required to sustain the previous defense program, that is the program before we had the 2018 National Defense Strategy. On top of that, for this year's budget, you have the unfunded requirement, as well as deeper investments in the RDT&E accounts, where I would emphasize, and then holding off on the legacy platforms this budget would take out in terms of ships and aircraft and the like. You do that, and you quickly go to the kind of end pocket of that 5% real growth. You're way beyond $50 billion.
And so, you know, if the top line weren't raised, I mean, I think we could probably both agree, and probably all of our witnesses agree, that it's not like there's not fat in the Pentagon budget, right? There's fat in there. There's no way. Given that you are not in government, you are not a HASC staffer anymore, tell us what you would do if you were king for the day and had to make up that 3 to 5% by cutting from existing fat.
First, I would thank you for the opportunity to be king for the day.
You're welcome.
It doesn't happen anywhere, especially my home. But it's managed radically inside the department, and let the Office of Management and Budget and the President of the United States publicly tell the Secretary of Defense that whatever you find, you get to reinvest. And this has been a consistent failure. You've seen it in your time in government, where the Department of Defense was told to find savings that they could reuse, both Republican and Democratic administrations, and ultimately OMB said, I'd like to take that back. Where would I put it? R&E is a key place. Obviously, some money towards readiness.
No, where would you take it from? We all have ideas of where we would put it. It's taking it that's the problem. So you're not up for re-election here. So why don't you tell us where you would take it from?
All right, I would go into programs of record, and I would compete the hell out of them. The program of record is the single most, I think, the biggest obstacle towards finding savings and introducing new capabilities. It hasn't been revisited in decades. So take it from the inefficiencies in programs of record. They block new ideas, and they drive inertia and ultimately waste. And
then, I've kind of come to this idea when it comes to, for instance, competition with China. It's sort of like it's them, not us. Our system is so bureaucratic, so big, so slow to acquire new technology, so difficult to understand our supply chains, as Mr. Gallagher and I have been looking at, that just we are more bureaucratic than China for various reasons. Of course, we're a democracy. Are there processes at the Defense Department that should be changed in order to save money? Not just programs of record, right? A big system, for instance, but processes.
I think the budget process needs to be changed radically. You have to go back to Secretary McNamara in terms of the process the department follows today. Now, obviously, I'm channeling a different Zakheim here in terms of expertise, but it's mind-boggling that we have $715 billion budget and we're using a budget process that comes from the 1960s. Fortune 500 companies, small companies, would look at our process and laugh. I mean, the fact that you're preparing a budget 2 years in advance and doesn't account for any changes in real time because it just doesn't allow for it, immediately, to me, screams out that that needs to be radically reformed.
Great, thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And for the members' information, we've got the comptroller, Mr. McCord, coming over to talk to us tomorrow at 11 o'clock for a briefing on precisely that issue, that two-year budgeting process. Because when you're talking about innovations happening a lot faster, and we're losing out on a lot. We do the R&D, we develop the technology, and it's okay. We'll give 2 years from now, we'll tell you whether or not we're going to buy it. And phew, it disappears. So we really need to reform that process. The appropriators are incredibly hostile to the idea of reforming that process. They like to control it. But here is where I think congressional control is undermining what we need to do to really, spend money efficiently at the Pentagon. So that's a recommendation for tomorrow's briefing, 11 a.m. with Mr. McCord. Mr. Gallagher, you are recognized.
Well, it's taken us an hour and a half talking about threats to America. I'm glad we finally identified that the appropriators are among them.
For the record, that's not what I said.
That's what I chose to hear. Let's talk a little bit about the Davidson window. I wish I would have trademarked the term, Mr. Zakheim, but I'm glad that you mentioned it. I assume, based on your comments, that you agree with what Admiral Davidson said in terms of within the next 6 years, a Taiwan scenario could be likely, and maybe talk specifically about what how you think the Olympics plays in that.
Thank you, Congressman, and I should have footnoted you on the Davidson window, but yeah, I defer to Admiral Davidson. He's seeing it in the ops and intel more closely than I have. But I do think, if I'm China, the window is post-Olympics. 2022 is going to be a huge propaganda platform for the Chinese Communist Party. Once they get that, the endorsements, the participation, then they will feel the confidence and the risk profile goes down, given that they would have already achieved the Olympics. So I would look kind of after 2022, and I think it brings before this Congress, perhaps not within the jurisdiction of this committee, to really think deeply about what the United States should or should not be doing vis-a-vis the Olympics in China.
I guess for the rest of the panel, do you disagree with Admiral Davidson's assessment, or maybe put differently, do you disagree that it makes sense, regardless of how likely or unlikely you think an attempted invasion of Taiwan is, do you think it still makes sense to plan around that most dangerous course of action by the PLA, if that makes sense?
I think when we're looking at that, oh, go ahead, Dr. Pettyjohn.
I'm sorry. Please.
We'll go ahead.
I think we need to make sure that we're not discounting the power of our allies in those kinds of circumstances, and I think particularly with the Olympic scenario that you're talking about, that we should not forget about. I think there are going to be a lot of opportunities for people to remember why China isn't their chosen ally for a lot of goals that we all share and how we want rule of law and our international system to work. So I think there are opportunities for us there in addition for things for us to be worried about.
Dr. Pettyjohn?
I agree that's a scenario we should be focused on and that we have to balance risk across time, but I think there are many of ways to do that don't mortgage the future, because if we focus too much on the present right now, we won't be making the investments that we need to modernize our capabilities and get those leap ahead technologies.
So it seems we all agree we should be planning around that scenario. I mean, if you had a minute with the Secretary of Defense and he asked, what is sort of the one thing we could do to deter, not win the conflict, deter the conflict over Taiwan from happening, what would be that one thing? We'll start with Mr. Zakheim.
In this respect, I think it's a combination of presence and policy, statements that we are there to support Taiwan, the free people of Taiwan, and third thing, weapons sales.
Ms. Smithberger?
I would just reemphasize the policy aspect, and again, that we need to focus on hardening our system so that we can show that we are going to be strong against them.
Ms. Pettyjohn?
Long-range munitions and improving the resiliency of our existing posture in the Pacific.
Great. And finally, Mr. Zakheim, I thought your response to Mr. Khanna was quite good in terms of, I think what makes this competition more complex is just the economic component of it. My own view is slightly different. I think the primary threat is neither military nor economic per se, but rather ideological. I think if you sort of interrogate what the CCP has said recently, they've gone to school on the failures of the Soviet Union and concluded, she himself has concluded, that part of the reason they failed was insufficient commitment to the party and its ideology. And I think the real threat posed by China is that they're offering a model that we may not understand as attractive, but a lot of people around the world could understand as attractive. So that's less of a question, more of a comment, but I'd be curious if there are any quick lessons based on your knowledge of Reagan that we can learn about the nature of ideological competition.
I think it's actually our advantage, because I think from the ideological standpoint, freedom wins. And I think that's a lesson from Reagan. He started everything with the Soviet Union talking about freedom and talking about the plights of dissidents before he got into the economic or the military issues.
Michelle.
Thank you, and thank you to all our witnesses for being here today. Ms. Smithberger, I think it was really interesting you pointed out the cost of privatizing so many of the jobs in our military. I was in the military at a time when I think just about every flag officer made an extra star by privatizing some portion of our workforce, and I think we're seeing the results of that now. Over the past few months, in talking to sustainment officers and acquisition officials about the amount of risk we are taking on with certain modernization priorities, there are places where we're spending so much time and money shoring up weaknesses today without enough attention being paid to the long-term sustainment costs that these programs are going to incur. So I think we can all agree that modernization is a critical effort. But I'm starting to fear that we're boxing ourselves in by throwing all of our resources at programs that are effectively going to eat our innovation budget in years to come. So can all of you provide your assessment of the DoD's innovation enterprise? Are we investing in a cost-effective way? Are we prioritizing short-term gains at the cost of long-term sustainability? I just would be very interested in your thoughts in that area. Thank you.
I will go ahead and go first. So I think one thing I would really underscore is as we pursue this innovation, something that the department's starting to emphasize more that I hope Congress will support is that we get the intellectual property rights for some of these things, because that's going to really be key to being able to control costs later down the line. And that's, again, where I think it's important to have some real budget consequences for some of these kinds of programs as well, because I think that without that, we are going to continue to see poor performance, to see programs have huge cost overruns, and that it's going to eat into other priorities. I think accountability is just so important.
And what do you see as the consequences in program areas that we do not have the IP rights per our contract?
So that's where you get the TransDigm kinds of situations where you get companies that are able to buy the suppliers for these different kinds of parts, and where we see prices go hugely over cost, where we aren't able to get cost or pricing information that we need to in order to be able to control those costs, where we don't have the kind of acquisition workforce that we need and have them be empowered. We're probably underinvesting in the Defense Contract Audit Agency as well. I think if you know that there is going to be someone looking over your shoulder, you're going to be a much better steward.
Just a little bit of disagreement there. I think if we're trying to modernize the force for the digital era, we need to introduce software. Software in the commercial sector is all about maintaining the IP. The way that I think we could incentivize those low prices or lower prices is by having competition in the program of record when it comes to software. I think that's a much better course of action than trying to own the IP and asking DCAA to enforce. I think that's failed us when hardware was the rule for acquisition. I would not recommend it when it comes to software.
I would just add that in terms of the innovation enterprise, you see that you want to innovate by encouraging the services to compete and fostering a healthy competition among them. And I think that Deputy Secretary Hicks is attempting to do that, to encourage them to and reward them with a larger share of the budget if they come up with innovative and cost-effective ideas that make a difference on the battlefield. I would also point out that the operations and maintenance costs of our older weapons are growing significantly and are one of the big things that consumes a large portion of the budget today.
Thank you. And Dr. Pettyjohn, I can't help but ask if you would just expound a little bit upon your comment that we need to focus on long-range munitions, something really, I think, critical to our workforce in my district.
Absolutely. And all of the war games I run, we run out of munitions. We don't have the right ones, which means we have to put our forces at risk. So we need long-range anti-ship missiles. We need long-range anti-surface missiles, anti-radiation, and anti-armor munitions. That means we can launch strikes from farther away and enhance the survivability of our forces.
Thank you so much, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate our panelists today. My first question is to Mr. Zakheim, and then I got some other general questions for the whole panel. I think the current administration and the previous ones made a very strong case why we need to have a military focused on China, the rising threat, with to include the economic side of it and the military side. And there's portions of their military that are more advanced than ours, like hypersonic weapons. What concerns me, though, is the actions do not match the words in this administration. This budget is a 1.7% increase in spending, and it was made at a time we had 2 to 2.5% inflation. So, Mr. Zakheim, to me, that equates to about a $5 billion cut. What's the analysis you have there?
I think your numbers are accurate. If you're not growing, you're falling behind, and particularly in a competition. And that's why today I've advocated for the recommendation from the National Defense Strategy Commission to see that top line not only have real growth, but get to this 3 or 5% window. And I think a lot of the capabilities that my colleagues today have said we need, not just to prevail in the strategy kind of in the Middle East and Europe, we might absorb risk there even at a 5% increase scenario, but to at least do what we need to do in Indo-Pacific, we're absolutely going to need real growth.
So in reality, we're looking at about a 1% cut in our defense budget. At the time this budget was made, now this month we're looking at 5% inflation. And I saw a number yesterday, 7%. We're talking a $30 to $40 billion cut in real terms if those numbers hold true. Again, the actions of this administration is not matching the words of trying to get a budget that meets the Chinese threat, and I just think we have to make that clear. I want one more question for Mr. Zakheim. Is our budget taking us the right direction to sustain our nuclear modernization, particularly in the ICBMs?
Thanks for that question. This budget fully funds. It's $28 billion towards modernization. I think this committee, and no doubt the oversight will do this, look at this nuclear posture review. There's some language in the interim national security strategic guidance which suggests that the administration wants to rely less on nuclear weapons. My own view from the National Defense Strategy Commission is that it plays an even more important role given what we're trying to do by focusing on China.
Ms. Pettyjohn, you talk about long-range fires. Does the B-21 factor in large with your analysis there?
Absolutely. Bombers, including the next generation bomber, the B-21, are important in terms of being able to deliver some of those missiles. Although we would be looking at finding better and preferred munitions for most of our platforms as a way of enhancing their capability.
I know the Army's been talking about long-range surface-to-surface missiles. There's a basing issue, but where do you see that piece fit into the puzzle?
I do think that there is an access challenge in the Pacific right now with respect to Army missiles. You do imagine that they could be useful in some situations for hitting fixed targets early in a conflict, but they are reasonably expensive and need to have a lot of range in the Pacific because it is a very large theater.
I'm the co-chair of the Baltic Security Caucus. So really to anyone on the panel or any of the panelists here, are we doing enough to deter for our 3 Baltic countries? Is there more that we should be doing? Curious for your assessment.
I had an opportunity to go to Lithuania pre-COVID. Seems like a long time ago, but it wasn't that long ago. Military sales are critical. Cooperation on cyber, which this committee led on years ago, continues to be something that they focus on. And then the distributive force out of European Command, some level of presence there makes a huge difference, not only in the straight-up deterrence by denial concept, but also in the psychology and support and assurance of our allies.
Anyone else?
I would just add that the Army is making improvements and stocking the pre-positioned heavy equipment in Europe, but it's still in Western Europe, and it has to get to the East if in the event of a conflict. So we could do more in terms of putting heavy Army forces farther or forward to the East and make sure that they have the right enablers in terms of air defenses and rocket artillery that is long range enough to allow them to overmatch the Russians.
What I'll do is I'll just close on this point. I've asked the administration to consider some permanent basing options for the Baltics because ultimately a U.S. flag is probably the most important thing for deterrence. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Jacobs is recognized for 5 minutes. You're muted, or at least we can't hear you at any rate. So if there's a way to unmute there. Thoughts? Yeah. Sorry, you're not muted. Go ahead. Nope. Sorry, you have technical problems and we're not hearing you. We will attempt to resolve those technical problems here shortly. And with that, I will recognize Mr. Courtney while we try to resolve those problems. We'll get back to Ms. Jacobs if we can.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this year actually is the first year of full official production of what I think a lot of the leaders in the Department of Defense have described as the country's #1 acquisition program, which is the Columbia program. And good news, Ms. Smithberger, the 85% design completion before production and a lot of prototyping, knock on wood. You know, we're going to see, you know, some of the issues that you raised addressed. But again, we're looking now, you know, prospectively between now and well into the 2030s of about $5 to $6 billion a year. I mean, this is just a big program, and it's a must-do program. I think is pretty widespread agreement across the board. Back in 2015, Congress passed the National Sea-Based Deterrence Fund, which was a piece of legislation recognizing the fact that this expenditure is just going to sit on the shipbuilding account year in and year out, even though it's a platform which carries about 70% of our nuclear stock, you know, available stockpile, and frankly isn't really part of the Navy. It reports to Strategic Command, not to through the channels there. It also created multi-year authorities that created efficiencies that, again, is one of the reasons why I think it appears to be a promising program in terms of avoiding wasteful, you know, funding and giving supply chain folks, you know, confidence that they can, you know, do the work that they need to do in terms of, you know, as I said, reducing unnecessary costs. You know, it's the NSBDF, which again ran into a lot of opposition from the appropriators, was a recognition, again, that this is a once in a multi-generation moment to deal with a program where these boats are going to be on patrol till the 2080s. I just was curious whether Mr. Zakheim or Pettyjohn have any comments regarding whether this approach that Congress enacted, it's law right now, but it has not been fully embraced by the Pentagon in terms of making it a special account, recognizing what we thought was a strategic program as opposed to necessarily a shipbuilding program. Just curious what your take is, if you can comment.
No, sure. And I remember when you and I think Congressman Forbes and others pushed this forward, rightly looking around the corner, knowing that this needed to be prioritized. I mean, your work on the Columbia class and then the Fast Boats Virginia class, and demonstrating to everybody how multi-years helped the industrial base and actually helped bring costs down has been instrumental in the undersea capability. To me, whether you have, I'd support any approach that maximizes shipbuilding in any form, and whether you go with the fund that you've proposed or doing it out of the shipbuilding accounts doesn't really matter to me, other than we need to make sure we're getting maximal investment in what everybody agrees is a critical priority. And I think the multi-year authorities you put in there are absolutely critical. Industry needs that. It's a great message to allies and important message to adversaries alike, and we tend to get more capability for less money.
Ms. Pettyjohn, do you have any?
I would just, sure. I would just add that I think that there have been proposals, and I've seen beyond putting all of the nuclear forces into their own account to take them out of the services budget, because we have the modernization bill coming due for all three legs of the triad right now. And that is taking up a significant portion of the investment budget. That could be a sensible thing to do, to pull that out, so then you can see what is left for your conventional forces.
Great. I mean, the other advantage of the law is that it gives the Pentagon the ability to sweep up funds that are unobligated, and every penny that you can use, again, is a penny saved for again, other shipbuilding programs, which again, we're going through this again this year in terms of trying to figure out a way, with a tight top line to make sure that we, again, address what I think is the National Defense Strategy call for maritime defense. So with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Banks is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zakheim, in the last couple of years, you've been a part of two very significant efforts. One was the Future Defense Task Force that was led by this committee that Representative Moulton and I both co-chaired. And the other effort was something that you led, something I think is very significant and deserves a lot more attention, the Reagan Institute's Task Force on 21st Century National Security Technology and Workforce. And in both of those efforts and in both of those reports, a lot of attention was drawn to something called the Valley of Death. And I wonder, for purposes of this committee, if you could spend a couple of minutes and explain what the Valley of Death is and provide us with some policy recommendations from the Reagan Institute and what we could do to solve it.
Thank you, Congressman, and thanks so much for your participation on the Reagan Institute Task Force, and really kudos to you and Congressman Moulton on the work you did in the Future Defense Task Force. The Valley of Death is one of those metaphors that is spot on accurate. You can't accuse it of being kind of overly dramatic. It's when you have investments in RDT&E, you have something that might get some pilot funding, but it can't enter a program of record. It just gets cut out. It can't kind of muscle its way in to where the real resources reward a program or an idea. And so it's kind of like early venture stage that doesn't get that late round funding that allows it to really go big time and get the support from an IPO or a private equity company. And so if we can't get those new technologies that we're experimenting with to enter a program of record, either to be a part of or to be its own program record, it will die in that Valley of Death.
What can we do about it? I mean, I've heard the Valley of Death term for 5 years as a member of Congress, and it doesn't seem like it's going away.
A lot of ink has been spilled on this. The one I'm thinking about today is integrating it into a program of record, competing elements within the program record to introduce these new technologies and capabilities. So it's classic competition and really breaking down the stubbornness of a program of record not to allow new things in, as opposed to an approach which I think you heard in the Future Defense Task Force, which you ran, which is let's just go big on perhaps an RDT&E program, give them procurement authority. I'm fine with that. It just hasn't happened. Let's compete within a program of record is the other thing I would offer.
And why don't you tell us, for purposes of the committee, where can members of Congress and those who are paying attention to this hearing today find the Reagan Institute's Task Force report?
Thank you for that opportunity. Never walk away from self-promotion here for the Reagan Institute. Go into the Google machine and write Reagan Institute Task Force, and you'll see the recommendations there.
I think it's really important, so I appreciate you drawing more attention to that. I know there's been a lot of attention today drawn toward the President's budget, overall budget. And I wonder, Mr. Zakheim, can you, again, I know it's repetitive, but again, give us a sense of how this budget lines up with our greatest and growing concern of a rising Chinese military, especially the Chinese Navy. Is this budget submission by the Biden administration, is it good enough for us to compete with the greatest adversary that we face on the globe today?
Yeah, thank you for that, Congressman. I think I stand with the statement of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs who testified before this committee, like I mentioned before, that this budget has a bias toward future operating environments. And that bias, to me, I understand it to mean absorbing risk in this near-term window. When we think about the Davidson window, which I had a chance to discuss with Congressman Gallagher, right, we're exposing ourselves too much in the short term, and that's reflected in this budget by taking out inventory of platforms that could be useful within this 5-year window. So I would say that is the biggest highlight I have in terms of what the risk is. Good things going forward, I think we could do more, but I like the investments in RDT&E. It should be celebrated. I like the investments in terms of nuclear modernization. But as you know well, Congressman, you've done this work, the near-term window is one we have to be very close attention to, and if we invite a vulnerability, it very well may be exploited.
Yeah, I have grave concerns that we aren't doing enough, but I appreciate that feedback. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. We will give Ms. Jacobs another try.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
All right, victory. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to our witnesses for being here. I wanted to start with you, Ms. Smithberger. In your written testimony, you say you worry that in too many instances, the proposed Biden budget proposes getting rid of proven and cheaper systems in favor of immature technology and costly ones. I know we've talked a little bit about this already here, but I was wondering if you could talk about some examples of that. I know on the committee, we talk a lot about the question of the current Minuteman III system versus what could come from that with modernization. But I was wondering if you could point out some other examples where you think the department is pursuing costly new systems when the current systems are adequate.
I think one system that we would really focus on is the A-10, and in relation to the F-35. We already have so many of these fighter jets. We already are going through testing. There are so many retrofits that we're going to have to make based on problems that we're discovering that I don't think accelerating acquisition of the F-35 is beneficial to us. And while I hope we don't have to keep on fighting ground wars, we think the close air support capacity that the A-10 provides is an important one.
Okay, thank you so much. And Dr. Pettyjohn, you talk a lot about the risks of overstretch and argue that the Biden administration's current approach performs poorly against priority threats. Yet you seem to support this divest in order to invest, since retiring old and less capable weapons is necessary to fund modernization. I guess, I know that we've already asked you to talk about what places you would divest from, but do you agree that many of these new programs are coming in over cost and behind schedule? And, in my short time here, we've, seen a lot of failures, whether it's the LCS or the delays in the DD-21 program or this recent abandonment of the electromagnetic railgun, just examples that we end up spending a lot of money on things that don't end up working. And so the trade-off is really a lot harder than just divest to invest, because we're actually not good at that invest piece either.
I would agree. We don't have a great track record lately of investing, and that's one area where the Pentagon needs to improve. And I know this administration is focused on improving and really pushing forward the defense innovation agenda and ensuring that they come up with ways to overcome the valley of death. So yes, the recent track record is not great in many respects, but at the same time, the weapon systems that we have, many of them are increasingly costly to operate. Every single hour that you fly or sail one of these, it costs more money, and that is eating up an increasingly large proportion of the budget, which means that we can't make any future investments and that we're locked into these systems that eventually are going to go beyond their service life and that we're not going to be able to extend. So at some point, we have to figure out how to reform the acquisition process and to acquire new platforms in a timely manner that perform as promised.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Smithberger, I don't know if you had anything to add around that question of these new programs.
I think for a lot of this, it's about having discipline in our acquisition process. We don't need that many new laws. We need to actually follow the laws that we have. And when the department issues waivers to those laws and it increases risk, they need to be reporting to these committees about why they're doing so. And that information should be made public so that we can make sure that we're making responsible decisions.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Johnson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zakheim, hadn't had the pleasure of working with you. Got here a little late after you left. I'm glad you're back. In your testimony, you asserted that the FY22 budget's top-line request is inadequate to support the National Defense Strategy, of course, and you correctly pointed out that the top-line figure actually represents a cut from FY21 levels because it fails to keep pace with inflation, which is skyrocketing. And you've called for a 3 to 5% annual increase in line with the 2018 National Defense Strategy. So I was just going to see if you could expound a little bit more in what will be some of the real-world impacts of not funding our military at that target level of 3 to 5% annual growth.
Well, Congressman, thanks for the opportunity to answer that question. What I've been trying to outline today is we are faced with a serious tension between deterring today and making investments I think everybody on this panel agrees we need to make to prevail in a conflict with China in the future and to deter them in the future, and that the force needs to change. The question is, how much risk are we willing to absorb today, and whether it will be self-defeating because it would invite an adversary to exploit that vulnerability. The $37 to $52 billion that you would get this fiscal year at a 3 to 5% would allow you to mitigate some of that risk while also increasing investments for the future. And it's important, Congressman, to keep in mind that we're not just talking about a one-off for this year, but it actually put you on a trajectory that year over year would compound and give you additional dollars for investment. And I just want to make one more point on 3 to 5% real growth. Even if this Congress were to fund this number, it would still be below the 4% GDP threshold that many people point to. A 3% growth would be 3.6% GDP, 5% growth would be 3.7% GDP. By contrast, as I mentioned before, in 1985, the Congress authorized and appropriated 5.7% GDP dealing with the challenge of the Soviet Union.
And speaking of the 80s, you said earlier that China is really a greater threat than the Soviet Union was at the height of the Cold War, because not only do they have this great military prowess now, but also the economic power as well. And so it occupies a lot of our attention for obvious reasons. Of course, their goal is to become a world-class military, and I think that's their term, by the end of 2049. But you note that the annual dollar value of the PLA procurement is on course to surpass ours by 2024. That's tomorrow, in my estimation. So in your view, where is China in this mission that they've stated to become world-class by 2049? Are they ahead of schedule?
I mean, they're rapidly progressing. They're doing everything, as far as we can tell, to pursue that. That it's not a hollow statement, but it's something that they're actually trying to achieve. We'll see if they realize it. We need a cost-imposing strategy. We need to demonstrate that to them that their investments will be thwarted, that they need a new approach if they're going to challenge us or our allies. And that's the essence of the competition. But make no mistake, I'm not trying to make them 10 feet tall, but they're in pursuit of becoming 10 feet tall, and we need to compete with them along the way.
And they're not exactly engaging in full transparency, so we don't know what's going on behind the closed doors and everything they're planning and plotting and spending. Despite its flaws, one of the areas in the budget request that I was pleased to see was the full funding of nuclear modernization efforts, and this has come up this morning. Because of some of the shortcomings elsewhere in the budget request, the inadequate top line, reductions in aircraft procurement, et cetera, does that give the nuclear modernization elements an even greater level of importance?
Well, I think nuclear modernization has a heightened level of importance in this national defense strategy, because as we try to shift investments of the future, as we recognize that we need to push platforms out of Europe or the Middle East into the Indo-Pacific, the way we assure and deter is through our nuclear weapons, full stop. So we need to modernize them, because if they don't work, then we lose that deterrence. That's true. I think the administration does a great job in FY22. I would encourage this committee to exercise strict oversight over the nuclear posture review, because they may be going in a different direction, but those are facts, not yet in evidence.
Very good. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Horsford is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our witnesses for your testimony. Ms. Smithberger, the FY22 budget request fully funds all aspects of the department's planned nuclear recapitalization efforts, including the ground-based strategic deterrent. This funding is included even though the nuclear posture review is ongoing. The current intercontinental ballistic missile system, the Minuteman III, was designed to operate for 10 years, but it is now over 50 years old. While multiple life extensions have kept the system safe and reliable, I understand the Air Force determined another such life extension would cost more than GBSD and would not meet system requirements. Yet some continue to suggest another life extension. In your testimony, you argue that nuclear weapons spending is growing at an unsustainable rate. The spike in spending you highlight is largely due to the GBSD acquisition and other recapitalization efforts. I firmly believe that any delay in recapitalization to include another life extension of Minuteman III will lead to exponentially higher cost in the mid to long term and sacrifice critical strategic deterrent capabilities that cannot be brought back. Strategic deterrence underpins every Department of Defense mission and investment and is the most critical component of our national security. Ms. Smithberger, your testimony highlights concerns over the near-term spending increases caused by nuclear recapitalization, but fails to consider the long-term impacts of delaying these investments. So putting the unthinkable risks of a failure of strategic deterrence aside, how do you consider the future financial risks of delayed recapitalization in your analysis of the 22 budget?
I think these are going to be significant investments no matter what we make, and that we have overwhelming nuclear superiority. I think it's important that we continue to maintain our deterrence, but I think as we look at all the different kinds of national security threats that we are trying to address, we're not going to be able to pay for everything. And I think it's important for everything to be on the table to make sure that we are considering where there might be opportunities for cost savings so that we can be the most effective force that we can be.
Thank you. And Ms. Smithberger, I do agree with your assessment of the risks of cuts to so-called legacy programs to fund unproven net generation capabilities. You testified that in too many instances, the department proposes getting rid of proven and usually cheaper systems in favor of immature technology and more costly systems. You write that these programs are nearly always over cost and behind schedule. For this reason, I'm concerned by the Air Force's continued effort to end procurement of the MQ-9 Reaper. While I support the efforts the services may be making towards a next-generation ISR capability, we cannot overlook the incredible value the MQ-9 platform provides to commanders today. The MQ-9 is the most cost-effective platform the Air Force owns. It flies 11% of the total Air Force flying hours at only 2.6% of the Air Force's total flying hour cost, and is needed more now than ever as we complete our withdrawal from Afghanistan. So, Ms. Smithberger, can you expand on your concerns related to an over-reliance on new and immature systems when compared to proven and cost-effective platforms such as the MQ-9 Reaper?
Absolutely. So as Mr. Zakheim was referring to, I think in too many instances, what we have being promised is a PowerPoint and that we don't have a proven capability to replace something. So I think for any proposal that comes before this body, it's important to look at whether we are willing to take the risk that is being proposed.
Thank you. Short, succinct, and to the point. I appreciate that, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Carl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Rogers, I'd like to thank our witnesses, obviously, for joining us today and talking about this topic that's very important to all of us. By 2030, the Chinese Navy is expected to have about 425 ships, with the U.S. Navy at 350 ships. It's clear the Chinese will continue to invest large amounts of money into the Navy during this coming decade. Unfortunately, the Biden administration has submitted a budget request that does not adequately meet this threat. The Biden administration even fails to increase at a 3 to 5% above inflation as recommended by the bipartisan National Defense Strategy Commission. Mr. Zakheim, did I pronounce that correctly?
It's Zakheim, sir, but I'll respond to anything.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the correct. In your written testimony, you highlighted your concern with the low top-line numbers from the Biden administration and the impact this has on our Navy. Given the Chinese Navy is expected to be at 425 ships by the end of the decade, can you expand on what this budget request does to our readiness now and into the future?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. And listen, I think particularly when it comes to Navy, quantity has a quality all of its own, and the number of ships matter. I think in this budget, the 7 cruisers that this proposal would take out of the fleet is one that I think this committee needs to look at. And if you had the 3 to 5% real growth, you could mitigate and keep that in the Navy. With respect to what the Chinese are doing, let them build ships. Just invest in our capabilities that my colleagues have spoken about to take those out. Let's make that part of our cost-imposing strategy. And I think that needs to be the mindset. We need to see what they're doing, learn from it, and then make those investments so we kind of turn this thing on them where we have some cost-imposing strategies. So yes, I think in the near-term window, this Davidson window that we've been discussing, we need to make sure that we keep those ships in the fleet and then also make those investments where we make the Chinese understand that they're wasting their money on their shipbuilding efforts.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Mr. Waltz is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to talk about the Army for just a moment, and again, thank you to all of the witnesses. I think we've talked a lot about deterrence today, and I completely agree. Having a ship offshore, having long-range fires has a deterrent effect. I don't think we can lose sight of the fact that having an American soldier wake up in a foxhole next to its ally also has a very strong deterrent effect. But Mr. Zakheim, or really any of the witnesses, I'm interested in what we could do, though, in terms of cost savings going forward. I'm particularly interested in what we can do with the Guard. You look at particularly Army Guard formations, but both Army and Air Guard, you're looking at 30 to 40% of the cost. Yet, you do get that strategic deterrent value and capability. You also get a domestic capability that the active duty Army doesn't have. But you have the ability, particularly through the state partnership program, to also deploy and have that partnering and allied effect. So I think you get a lot of bang for the buck there. Do you see perhaps force structure transferring to the Guard as a way in a resource-constrained environment that we can do a lot of those things that we still need to do, everything from hurricanes and wildfires to fight our land wars at less of a cost?
Thank you, Congressman. It's great to see you. I think in terms of the Guard capability, we should make sure we're giving them assets that are valuable both in how they would deploy overseas, but also what they can use at home. To the extent that the Army can get that balance right, I think that's a wise investment. The state partnership program, which you highlighted, is absolutely critical as a form of assurance and, frankly, coordination with our allies and partners. I think that is a great initiative. And I think overall forward presence is something that is really critical for deterrence, as we discussed today. And the American people, quite frankly, support this. when we've asked in our Reagan National Defense Survey, which I know you're familiar with, would you support having forces overseas to support kind of peace? They overwhelmingly stand behind that, and I think some of what you're describing here would be actions to support that objective.
So I completely agree. I could just foresee a construct in the future, again, in a budget-constrained environment where our active forces are primarily forward. But the strategic aspect, which is going to take weeks, if not months, to get on the civilian reserve fleet that Mr. Whitman rightly pointed out is very lacking. It's that kind of domestic force rather than having active duty armored divisions sitting in CONUS. I think we could get perhaps a different mix. I just want to switch to the Navy. Frankly, I think a lot of the discussions are somewhat nibbling around the margins of LCS or retiring cruisers. The bottom line is we don't have the industrial base to compete. The Chinese are approaching an estimated 1,000 shipyards, yet we have around 24, many of which are a century old and are decrepit and falling apart. Yet there is not a single shipyard requested in President Biden's infrastructure package. Anywhere between $600 billion to $3.5 trillion that we're debating here in the Hill, and none of it addresses shipyards when we are a maritime nation. And with the Chinese building ships at a rate of 5 to 1, they're cranking on one every 6 weeks. Does anyone disagree? Speak up if you disagree that shipyards aren't considered infrastructure and should be in this infrastructure package.
I think when we're looking at the private shipyards, that we need to look at some of the moral hazard that occurs by giving handouts to some of these companies that have been underinvesting in their own infrastructure in this manner. And several of these companies have been engaging in stock buybacks at the kinds of levels that we're proposing to give to them to make these kinds of repairs. So I think we have to make sure that if we are including shipyard funding, I think it's very hard to make a compelling case to the American people that the Department of Defense does not already have adequate resources to cover those needs.
I just quickly disagree. I think the opportunity with infrastructure bills to incentivize not only the build and manufacturing of semiconductors in this country, but also what you're talking about, shipbuilding, and it could be put in there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield you back 5 seconds.
Great, thank you. We are about wrapped up. Mr. Fallon is going to be the last person to ask questions, and then we will adjourn. Mr. Fallon, you are recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And thank you to all the witnesses. This has been fascinating. And I'm new and freshman trying to learn and absorb and be a sponge. And a lot of very good questions have already been asked, and I don't want to rehash any of those. But so Secretary Austin, he testified here in March, and he said that the #1 threat that we face is the U.S., that it's China. And then they announced that they're going to increase their defense budget approximately 7%, I believe. And so a question for the panel, anybody who wants to jump in, is what kind of justification do the Chinese have? Granted, they have a lot of international frontiers, but what significant threat do they face from any of their neighbors in that theater to justify a 7% increase? Or is it simply obviously because they're trying to pass us in the world stage? If I just wanted to, I guess, to go with Dr. Pettyjohn first.
I think that they are clearly trying to supplant the United States in the Indo-Pacific and to establish themselves as the dominant power in the region. They don't have to justify their defense expenditures to a domestic audience like we do, given the different government that they have.
I'm just going to add that this is the #1, well, will be the largest economy in the world. To sustain that economy, they have to reach out beyond their region and extend globally. Energy interest example is why China's interested in the Middle East. So it's almost a natural course that they would seek to have this type of military and make this kind of investment.
And I would just add that China has significant internal problems as well, and whenever you have significant internal problems, it's very helpful to focus outward.
Project externally, yeah. We've seen that in the past. One of the things that I find concerning just with the budget is from just a real dollar perspective, or not real dollar, rather just raw dollars, it's 1.7% increase. But inflation, as we've talked about repeatedly in Congress, if it's just 3% this year, which very well may be much higher than that,
that would be just to match inflation would be $22 billion, and if it was a 5% increase, inflationary increase, it would be $37 billion just to have a flat budget. So, these seems to be real cuts. And one question I had for Mr. Zakheim is pivoting a little bit. Is your assessment the European deterrence initiative? We've been focusing a lot on the Pacific theater, and we have new allies in NATO. And I loved your comment about how certain allies have the will but not the capabilities, and others have the capabilities, not the will. And I thought in my head, not necessarily in any order, Poland, Germany, and you mentioned Poland. So if you wanted to just touch on that.
Yeah, I mean, the European Deterrence Initiative, which again I believe this committee, along with elements in the European Command, really led on, was critical in deterring Russia, and was a responsible thing for the U.S. to do after Russia's invasions in Georgia and Ukraine. And I think it needs to be sustained, but in a fashion that's proportionate to what needs to happen relative to the Indo-Pacific. And I think it's what we've been talking about today is the same theme, different variation, distributing the force, presence, exercises, and making sure that these are resilient. If I can, I'll just add on your point on inflation. I think something that this committee, I'm sure, is intuits but may want to focus on is that inflationary forces are more dramatic in the defense industrial base than they are in the macro U.S. economy. In other words, whatever's happening in terms of inflation, it's going to be more acute for the Department of Defense, and they'll get less bang for the buck.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really want to thank our witnesses for a very informative discussion. Appreciate it. And Mr. Rogers, you got anything for the good of the order? He does not, so we are good and we are adjourned. Thank you again.
Well, but you got time to get to me. I mean, I'll look at questions. They're all going to ask.